these three concepts: IQ, EQ, and AQ. So IQ and AQ you're probably familiar with to an extent. AQ is something that's relatively new, and it refers to the ability of a person to adapt to a new situation. So it's a measurement of adaptivity, essentially. Now, when you think about IQ, well, obviously I think that many of you have done IQ tests. There are many different question marks around that. Is IQ something that actually measures intelligence, given that you can actually train for it? We're not really sure. Is IQ something that's a good predictor for success? That's something that I'm going to leave for you to decide. There is research that shows that different levels of IQ are associated with different jobs, and generally you can probably see here for yourselves already that the lower paid jobs tend to be associated with slightly lower levels of IQ than the higher paid jobs. But then again, the gap is nothing kind of shocking, you know, so these people still fall in a relatively similar level of IQ, and given that you can actually train and increase your cognitive ability through certain practice tests, etc., it's kind of a questionable concept in terms of how credible IQ is as a measurement. But still, it's very widely used, and if you look at it kind of on a very broad scale, you're still going to notice that if you take the extreme cases, for example, medical doctors, at the top of the pile here with a fairly high IQ on average, and if you take, for instance, the bottom job of janitors or kind of just people operating machines or truck drivers, then you're still going to see that they have a fairly large gap in the average IQs that they show. So if you compare medical doctors, professor, engineers, lawyers to truck drivers, janitors, you see a gap there between the IQ. But again, that's not to say that IQ on its own is a certain measurement. They might also have other qualities, these people, that help them to be where they are, or they might have trained their IQ. So keep it in mind, but take it with a pinch of salt, and also think of different ways to increase your IQ. Now, EQ is something that employers tend to use very often, especially after they've hired somebody. So when they're hiring somebody, they might be looking at IQ performances or get them to do some certain thinking skill assessment tests. But after they've hired them, a lot of the work, especially in big corporate firms in the city, like here in Beijing, has to do with dealing with clients, has to do with taking decisions based on orienting yourself in different situations, and then EQ becomes much more relevant. So there are 4 components of EQ that we're going to look at briefly. The first one is self-awareness, the second one is self-management, the third one is social awareness, and the fourth one is relationship management. So looking at self-awareness, the first part of this is knowing your own emotions, knowing your moods, and knowing your behavioral tendencies. So in a way, that's more or less knowing yourself, knowing your own strengths, weaknesses, and limitations. So from these types of skills, you can also derive a certain amount of self-confidence. So by knowing yourself, by knowing that you're able to deal with your emotions and that you're able to assess your strengths and your weaknesses in different situations, you also tend to become more confident, and that tends to come across quite clearly when you're interacting with people. Now, the second part of EQ that we're going to look at is self-management. So that's essentially the management of your own emotions, not just knowing them, but being able to control them, and also being who you are to an extent. Now, of course, this can be slightly questionable depending on the situation, because you can't just let your emotions run freely. But here we're talking about the idea of conveying your emotions in a very kind of transparent yet calm manner, managing yourself, adapting and adjusting to new and changing situations, and this is usually something that is associated with people who tend to have high achievements, people who tend to do well in society and who tend to get to higher level positions, managerial positions, or positions of leadership or decision making, also tend to have fairly high emotional intelligence. So the third, the final kind of bullet point here is that usually self-management also comes with a certain dose of optimism, and these people tend to be quite upbeat about the future. Now the third part is social awareness, and this relates to knowing and understanding the emotions of others. So first of all, empathy is a skill that is absolutely necessary if you're going to deal with people-to-people relations and communications on a day-to-day basis, because it allows you to understand the feelings and the thoughts of others, and it also allows you to understand them even if they're not necessarily doing the right thing, or even if they're not necessarily making a decision that's rational from your perspective. You're still able to understand why they're taking it. So empathy is absolutely key in the sense that you need to understand how and why others are thinking the way they think and making the decisions that they make. Now the second point here is organizational awareness. It's crucial for people who want to perform well to see the larger picture in an organization. So not just to look at themselves, but to see kind of how processes and how their actions relate to the whole structure. How do they impact the structure? How do they impact others? How do they impact groups? How do groups impact the structure? So essentially an awareness of what is the organization, where do you stand, and how do you impact it, and how does it impact you? And finally, you have this point of being kind of willing to help others. That's also something that's associated with people who tend to perform well. They tend to take up tasks like mentorship. They tend to coach younger colleagues and to welcome them into the company. So social awareness comes into this bit of the puzzle. Now we also have relationship management, which essentially deals with managing the emotions of others. The first point here is that you need to be an effective communicator, to listen carefully to others and to respond to them appropriately. Use words and body language that accurately reflect your thoughts and your feelings. Remember that other people can't read your mind and what they see as the signs that you're giving them. So if you give them signs that convey what you want to say accurately, and if you're giving them signs that correspond to what they've told you, then you can manage your relationship with them more effectively. Secondly, you need to be able to recognize others and acknowledge the significance of what they do for the organization, of who they are and what they contribute. So that also goes into relationship management. And finally, we have the idea of teamwork. So people with high EQ tend to be cooperative, willing to share information. Of course, you need to be, in some cases, careful in terms of what you're sharing, especially if it's information that you don't want to be spread around too quickly, or if it's information that's confidential. But you still need to be able to share sufficient information to let others know about you or know about what you're doing, so that you can actually communicate with them on an emotional level. Now, in terms of relationship management, you have negotiation skills that come into play, especially if you're in a negotiation. Small differences between the two sides can often turn into much larger problems. So it's important that you're always ready to perhaps take a step back, or to perhaps calm the conversation down. So negotiation skills are a key part of relationship management. And this is something that is invaluable to a company, because most people find it fairly difficult to get over differences between them and to reconcile. But if you're able to do that, you're going to be an invaluable negotiator to a company. And then you also need to recognize that someone who sees the need, who can see the need to improve a situation and who works to make it happen, is a change catalyst. So if you're able to see what needs to be done in a certain situation and how it needs to be improved, why it needs to be improved, and you're working to do it, then you're going to be a change catalyst for that company or that organization. Now, question here is whether EQ can be raised. Psychologists disagree about the degree to which it can be raised, but they generally agree that EQ can be raised, that you can learn to get better at it, and this is something that you can definitely work on, and it's going to help you to perform much better in the workplace. Now, the benefits of EQ are invaluable. It makes you a much more efficient communicator. You can speak your wants and your needs much more clearly and much more precisely. You can respond to criticism, or you can present criticism in an appropriate way. You're going to solve problems much more easily, especially when they stem from certain, for instance, personality clashes. So the benefits of emotional intelligence are absolutely invaluable. They include also flexibility, understanding other people's needs, understanding that the world doesn't revolve around you or around one person, and respecting others' needs and emotions. And finally, you're going to be able to respond to difficult people, or to respond to kind of any outbursts of overly emotional or bad behavior in the workplace. That might happen, and it's almost inevitable if you're in a group of people for some people to occasionally lose control of their emotions. And if you're the person with the higher EQ and with the higher level of emotional management to self-control, then you're going to be able to respond appropriately in the situation. Now, there is evidence that leaders tend to have higher level of emotional intelligence, and they usually tend to exhibit characteristics like proactive behavior, perseverance, positive working relationships, and confidence. So emotional intelligence is something that also comes in when you have to either choose a leader, or when you have to kind of work your way up to a leadership position. And it also gets paired with things like confidence. So IQ and EQ have been something that's been part of the narrative when it comes to recruitment and to development of skills to prepare for the workplace. But more recently, we've had this idea of AQ, which essentially measures people's ability to adapt, and it has to do with certain technological changes in the landscape and with the automation that's been coming up and forcing some people out of their jobs. So it has to do with the so-called kind of fourth industrial revolution and the automation in factories, etc. Now, a study by the World Economic Forum predicts that 35% of the skills workers need will change by 2020, and that's a prediction that was made in 2017, so it's very soon something to come true. So essentially, what you need to keep in mind is that companies, and kind of this research that's quoted here is also in support of this point, is that companies need more problem solvers. They need more people that can adapt. They need more people that can learn new skills. They don't need any more people that just want to be dedicated to one type of job or one thing and do that for the rest of their lives, because it's not going to solve their problems. Companies are also under pressure from technological progress, from automation, etc. So essentially, there's lots of new initiatives like Fab Lab Hub and others that you can Google, and they offer training, they retrain people, they try to teach them new skills, and they try to keep them relevant to the workplace. Now, when you're talking about AQ, there are certain companies that have started using this idea when they're recruiting people, like L'Oreal, the company that for cosmetics, for instance, and others as well. But it's something that's likely to come into play more and more, and there might be soon, at least in my opinion, tests that might be developed for people to assess that, and certain sort of assessment procedures that can be more systematic. So AQ is something that might come into play. So keep your eyes open for that. Here are kind of three examples that come into play when you think about the organizational level and AQ. So first of all, we have the idea of kind of national AQ in a very abstract level. So you've seen, for instance, very recently from the US, the outburst against automation and new technology, and people having to change their jobs. That's a part of why a lot of people are in support of the trade war, because they want to reopen the factories rather than change their jobs. So essentially, there's for instance, I mean, this is just kind of based on case studies rather than systematic research, but there is this negative attitude towards having to adapt to new things coming from the US, for instance, at the moment, whereas in Sweden it's been very positive, and the Swedish have been very happy to automate things. It's almost been like a national policy there to do that. So it comes into play also at the national level and at the group level. If you think about organizations, Kodak has been notorious for its failure to adapt to the digital world. If you look at cameras, 30, 40 years ago, it was Kodak everywhere, and now they're essentially nowhere compared to anybody else. If you look at other companies, though, like IBM, they've been operating since the 19th century, more or less. I've read cases about IBM in the 1880s, if I remember correctly. And back then, they were selling things like tabulating machines. Then you had the typewriter market that came in, they adapted. Then you had the computer market that came in, they adapted. The first computer I owned, I think, was an IBM in 1996 or something like that. And then now we see IBM doing machine learning, so they're out of that. Well, they're not completely out, but they're kind of not dealing majorly with the computer production business anymore. And then when you think of individual abilities to adapt, you see kind of certain stories that are emerging, especially in business magazines, about people who tend to work, for instance, in corporate jobs and then get out of that and then retrain and then do something else, start their own company, moved into different fields. So you have this kind of high level of adaptability, and you can search for Yang Chang later. She actually launched one of the largest platforms for learning Chinese online. And she came from the corporate world. She didn't come from a linguistic background, for sure.